Good evening, everyone. This is Chris from Paint and Glory blog, and welcome to my new video, How to Paint World War I Ottoman Uniforms. Specifically, I'm going to be painting Arabs in Ottoman uniforms in 28mm figures for the game Blood and Valor. First of all, I want to say happy Thanksgiving to my American viewers, and also that this video is not brought to you by Google Slides. Google Slides, never designed to be video software in any way, but someone's got to do it. So today we're doing Arab Ottoman infantry, although you could probably use this guide to paint pretty much any Ottoman infantry. There's just going to be a couple of steps in here that are specifically for these figures that are the Arab Ottomans. So first of all, some reference photos. Arab Ottoman uniforms, well, unlike a lot of the armies of Western Europe, like Germany, uh, France, Britain, and those armies did fight in lots of different parts of the world. The Ottomans really fought in a lot of climates and a big variety of uniform qualities. Some of their uniforms, especially early in the war, were actually manufactured by their ally Germany and were of rather high quality, where a lot of the other uniforms were of Turkish make, but were still pretty good quality in the beginning of the war. But across the entire Ottoman Empire, over the course of the war, uniform quality dropped dramatically. Another thing that really changed is the official color of the Ottoman uniform was khaki. But as anyone who's ever tried to buy men's pants can tell you, there's no such thing as one khaki color. So, depending on what the actual dye that was used in the original uniform, the fading of the uniform, the climate conditions, you can find Ottoman uniforms in pretty much any shade between light tan and dark, practically greens. And then you even got some yellow or olivey colors in the middle. And you could see a variety of faded different shades of khaki. Often the pants did not match the jacket, did not match the shirts, did not match the head coverings, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. Did not match the leg wraps. So I am going to, as I said, be painting um, Arabs in Ottoman uniforms, and specifically, my figures are going to be Arabs who have deserted from the Ottoman army and are actually joining in with my British army, and thus I'm making their uniforms a little bit more ragtag. They're going to kind of look like these uniforms, where every figure's got different bits and bobs of color across the uniform. No two figures are going to have the exact same combination of different shades of khaki. Also, my Arab figures they're going to be wearing the Arab Kufiya head covering, the kind of headscarf that people of the Middle East often wear, rather than what you think of with the Ottoman helmets, which were either the early war Kabalak or the later war Bashlik. And you can see the Kabalak in the second figure from the left. It wasn't so much a helmet, it was really strips of cloth that was wrapped around a wicker frame, or the bashik was actually just wrapped around the head. So again, not really a helmet, just kind of a head covering. So with the Arab kufiyas, rather than if you imagine Arab headscarves today, they have a lot of patterns. From my reference photos, I was able to find that a lot of the kufiyas in the military were solid colors, and often they were a variation on khaki. Not always, but often. Finally, I'm going to give a plug here to a YouTube series that you probably, if you're watching this series, you've probably watched, and that's Indy Nidell's Great War series, which went through World War I week by week as it happened, but 100 years later. He has a series of videos on World War I uniforms, and I watched his video on Ottoman uniforms as part of my preparation for painting my Ottomans. So with that, we are going to move forward. Okay, so step 0, and I always forget to take a picture of the step alone, and that is priming the miniature. So I've gone with what you're probably used to by now, and I promise I don't always do this. A generic white spray, I believe it's Krylon from Michaels. I want to use a white primer because I really want to keep that contrast high in this figure. I'm a big believer that on historical figures, especially figures that are painted in very kind of like bland drab colors, like khaki or green or gray or brown, without a lot of contrast, which white can help with, then these figures can look very bland without it. This figure in particular is from the Gripping Beast Company, their Woodbine Design Company line, and like I said, is the Arabs in Ottoman uniform. So please ignore the fact that this uniform appears to have a weird brown stain on its leg that is from a wash experiment, and it will not really affect the end result of the figure. So the first step after priming is the skin, which, well, you already saw this picture. We're going to go in and do the skin first. We're going to work from the inside out so that especially that facial region, I don't have to kind of go in and paint the skin after I paint the uniform and end up getting skin colors on the uniform. If I paint the skin first, I can paint the uniform around it without needing to hit that skin. This is, I'm going to say, the first time I am painting Middle Eastern or Arab skin. I, like many miniature war gamers, I primarily paint Caucasian skin, although you also saw I have painted some Indian skin when I did a British Sikh force, although unfortunately I did not take photos of that process, so I don't have a painting video for that. I wanted to make this skin, Arab skin is not very dark like African skin or like South Asian skin. But at the same time, I want it to look distinct from European skin. So what I did is I took Army Painter Tanned Flesh, which is a dark Caucasian color or a tanned color, and I mixed it just a little bit with Army Painter's Monster Brown, which is a very, very light brown shade. It's a subtle difference if you put the tanned flesh next to this mix I've painted of tan flesh and Monster Brown, but it does give it, if you put it next to a figure painted with just tan flesh, it is a slightly different shade. I'm not 100% sure at the end of this if I really nailed Arab skin tones, but again, this is the first time I'm going for it. I'm also going to point out at this point that depending on your paint's opacity, you might want to go back and do a second layer of paint after the first dries, especially with the Army Painter paints. I find they almost always need a second coat because they're fairly transparent, but a lot of the Vallejo paints I'll use through this process can often get away with just one coat, depending on how much you thin it down. And speaking of Vallejo paints, that's our second phase is going to be the uniform. So you can see I've done a lot here. So I'm going to go through it starting with the biggest piece and moving on from there. So remember when I said the official Ottoman uniform was khaki? But that means pretty much anything? I mean anything. And every figure in this unit is going to get a totally different mix of khakis in it. We're going to be going through this particular guy, which you can see is kind of has three different shades of khaki going on, a little more green, a little more yellowy olive, and then a lighter tan. But I will show you all of the 10 figures that I painted so you can see kind of the variations that I did. For the biggest part of this figure, both the blouse jacket and the puttee leg wraps, I used actually Vallejo Model Colors Russian Uniform World War II, which is kind of a greenish khaki. Um, this will look a little less green once I start going in and putting a wash and putting a highlight on it. I realize it looks quite green right now. I promise in the end it won't be quite so green. It'll still be green, just not quite as green. For the pants, I'm using Vallejo Model Colors Green Brown, which is kind of, well, it's kind of a yellowy color, actually. Again, I promise it won't look quite that yellow at the end of this. And for his Kufiya head covering, that is Army Painter Skeleton Bone, just kind of like a medium tan color. His boots, and also, in fact, all of the figure's boots are using Vallejo Model Color German Camo Beige, which is a very light khaki. So in fact, that is the only part of their model that is really going to be the same, aside from skin tone and equipment, across all these models is going to be their boots. If you want your figures to be more uniform, like they're actually wearing matching uniform bits, you can really just pick any of the colors that I went over, the Russian Uniform World War II, the green brown, the Army Painter Skeleton Bone, or really any paint you have that is khaki-ish, and just instead of using it for bits of the uniform like I did, use it for the whole uniform, and you're going to get a much more unified military look, rather than the look I was looking for, which is a little more ragtag deserter. After the bulk of the uniform, we're going to move on to his belt and his rifle. His belt, which you can only see from the back of the uniform, this is another bit that I saw was very standard across Ottoman uniforms, regardless of the shade of their uniform. The belt was almost universally a dark brown, and so I used Army Painter's Oak Brown for this. And then for the agal, which is the rope that holds the kufiya in place on his head, that's usually kind of a very, very dark brown, almost black. I used Army Painter's Dark Stone for that. The rifle, I ended up mixing a bit of different browns and tans I had on my palette to go for kind of a muted light brown red tone. But to be perfectly honest, it ended up so close to Army Painter Monster Brown, I may as well have just used Army Painter Monster Brown. The metal parts of the rifle are Army Painter Necromancer Cloak, as is his belt buckle, which is not shown. It's hidden behind his rifle. And then for the rifle sling, that is in leather brown, which looks in this photo, you can see it's a little bit darker. After this, we're moving on to his equipment. These figures don't have a ton of equipment on them, but the canteen is Army Painter Monster Brown and then Army Painter Necromancer Cloak. You'll also notice if you watched my German video that canteen looks remarkably similar to the German canteen. That actually makes a lot of sense. The German military supplied a lot of equipment to the Ottomans, so it makes a lot of sense that a German canteen may have ended up in with Ottoman equipment, unless I painted it the same way. The satchel, I actually saw a lot of photos of relatively light colored off-white satchels. And so I did, in order to give this just a pop of brightness, I painted that in Army Painter's Mummy Robes, which is it looks very white in this photograph, in reality is a bit more of an off-white. And when I put a wash on that, it's going to really darken and kind of dirty that up. I also noticed at this point that this figure, along with a few others, actually were sculpted with some holes in the uniform, which I really appreciate and kind of goes along with the story of deserters that I'm using for this unit. So I went back and I picked out some of the those holes with flesh color. I believe this guy only has it in that elbow right there. And then I also kind of went back and cleaned up any mistakes I made along the way. You may have noticed in some of the photos I got some uniform color on the skin and so on and so forth. So I went back and fixed that up because the next step is the wash step. This is the second time that I am using Allie's brown liquid. It's a custom mixed wash from alliestoysoldiers.blogspot.com, and I'll provide a link in the show notes. It's a custom mix wash from 3 different shades plus a mixing medium. Allie, he or she uses Games Workshop washes. I use equivalent Army Painter washes, specifically 40% strong tone, 40% light tone, which is a bit of sepia, 20% quick shade medium, which is just pigmentless wash medium, and a few drops of blue tone to kind of dull down the warmth of the wash. I put this all over the model, especially because there's so many earth tones on this model. It kind of works pretty much everywhere. Go back and make sure you clean up any pools of wash, especially on the flat surfaces. And then really this thing is ready to go. You could put this on the table and I don't think you could really, there's nothing wrong with it. If I knew I was going to put this on the table after just a wash, I think I may have lightened up some of the tones around, so the whole thing would be a little lighter without the highlights. But since I knew I was going to go in and do some highlights, that wasn't necessary for me. So now that we've got this wash in, and you can see that really did dull down the green of the uniform jacket and the yellow of the pants. They look a little more khaki-ish, brownish drab. Now we're going to go in with our highlights. So the first highlight is going to go on the main part of the uniform, the jacket. This is also where I'm going to leave the leg wraps, the puttees, without any highlights, because I want the lower parts of the model to be darker to draw the eye to the upper and lighter parts of the model. It's also going to make the puttees look a little dirtier and a little darker than the higher parts of the uniform. So with this, I'm going back over that green khaki uniform with just the original base color, Vallejo model color Russian uniform World War II, and I'm going to cover about 50 to 60% of the uniform, just the most raised edges. I'm going to leave the recesses and the darkest areas where the wash gathered in those crevices. I'm going to leave those dark, but I'm going to brighten up the raised folds of the uniform jacket. As I mentioned, especially with these historical figures that have a lot of drab, brown and khaki colors, you really want to push contrast, because otherwise they're just going to look very, very washed out and very dull. And that's especially true on 20th century military figures, when armies started adapting more khakis and browns and tans and greens. And while this does not look very dramatic, the next step, not super dramatic, is the second highlight step. And that is I'm going to take my Russian uniform World War II, and I'm going to mix in a little bit of Army Painter Mummy Robes, an off-white. And this is going to make kind of a medium khaki green. It's not so green as the original Russian uniform. It is a lighter drab khaki green, and this is going to get painted on the 25% of the uniform folds that are the most raised edges, the very edges of the sleeves and of the bottom part of that tunic, and the parts of the shoulders that might be exposed to the sun the most. And for me, I'm going to stop here. If I was just painting a figure in just this color, I didn't have a mix of different colors across the figure, I would go for a third, even lighter highlight on the smallest, absolute smallest ranges of the uniform. But I think because there are already lighter parts of the uniform providing more contrast, I don't think a third highlight is necessary. I think these two highlight steps are more than sufficient. You could go for that third step if you want. And again, I think if you're going with just one uniform color instead of two or three, I would go all the way with the highlights. Especially once you get into these tiny highlights, it really doesn't take that much time to pick out the very edges of the cloth. The other thing that needs a highlight is the pants. Like the jacket, it's going to follow the same process. First, I'm going to go over the pants with about 50 to 60% of them with the original Vallejo monocolor green-brown base color. I'm also going to point out at this point in the video that this color is not quite as yellow looking in real life as it looks in these photos. The phone I was using to take these photos tends to apply, like a lot of phones do, a post-processing step after you take the photo that really kind of, in this particular case, tries to boost the saturation. I try to fight that when I take the photos. I try to lose that ultra saturation. I try to sometimes get rid of it with a little bit of photo editing, not a lot, but just a little bit. And I actually have a more color accurate photo later in this process. So if you're looking at this and you're saying, that's super yellow, I promise you it's not quite as yellow as it looks. And the next step's going to help too, because I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to take the green-brown color, I'm going to mix it with the little army painter mummy robes, and I'm going to get this kind of yellow, tan, brown, green, something or other color that's going along just the most raised edges of those pants. Again, they look quite yellow in this photo. I promise they're not quite as yellow as they look here. The third part of the uniform that needs highlighting is the Kufiya. And for this, because the mummy robes washed with Ali's liquid, brown liquid was so effective at creating contrast, I think it only needed one highlight here, which from very close up looks kind of dramatic. I will admit I need to work on my smooth blends a little more, but from 2 or 3 feet away, if you back away from your computer screen, it's going to look a lot better. If you give it that 3-foot rule, or someone would call it the 3-foot and man with terrible eyes rule. So we're just going to go in with the original skeleton bone to do the most raised parts of the folds and the edges of the kufiya. Now we're almost done. We're almost done. We just got a couple other things. We're going to highlight the skin and we're going to do some finishing touches. So for the skin, I'm going to admit, for my first time working on Arab or Middle Eastern skin, I'm not 100% sure how I did. The highlight here is very subtle. It's just, again, it's a mix of tan flesh and monster brown over the original tan flesh monster brown, which had the wash put on it. And then I did just a touch of tan flesh with no monster brown on the very tip of the nose and the very edges of the knuckles. I didn't want to keep going and really punch up the skin highlights because I was worried it would look too pale, too European. So I'm not 100% sure how it looks. I'm not unhappy with it, but I think it could be better. In terms of other highlights, I did go in and do some quick highlights with a dark steel color on some of the metal parts of the rifle to make it look like, even though it's a darkened steel, there is a little bit of metallic sheen on it. And then from here, we're pretty much done, except the base. So this is the finished figure with the base. Now you, of course, can base your figures to match your army however you like. I happen to use a mix of Vallejo monocolor Iraqi sand and my very useful mummy robe. And then I washed that with Army Painter Light Tone, kind of a light sepia, with a little bit of red in it. I watered that down with water, and then I did a light dry brush of the base color, the mix of Iraqi sand and mummy robe, and then ringed the base in black. Now this, I think, is actually a more color accurate photo of this model. It's a little more desaturated in this photo because this photo and the final couple photos I'll show you are also the first photos I took with my new phone / new camera. I got a new phone the other day. And one of the reasons I got it is because it has had excellent reviews, bringing really good photography. It's a Google Pixel 4a 5G. It's a terrible name, but I will admit it's a better camera than my old phone because I think it's more true to life. And so this figure is, I think, this photo is more accurate to how the figure looks in real life than some of the earlier photos, which were a little more saturated. And I think going forward, my figures are going to look a little more accurate in the photographs compared to how I see them in real life. And here he is with all, well, not all, but some of his buddies. And you can really see how I mix it up. I have the figure next to him. It has one of the kind of more yellowy uniform jackets with the green pants. I have a figure in the back with a red Kufiya, just to give one of these figures a real pop of a vibrant color. I've got a figure that's almost all tan in the back there. I've also mixed in, some of them have a color that didn't appear on the primary figure that I painted, which is Vallejo model colored khaki. That actually appears on the kufia of the two figures in the back right and the back middle. And then here's a couple more of his buddies also appearing with a variety of different cones on their figures. So they're all, you can see they're all of the same colors, just different little combinations. And if you're wondering, again, if you're wondering exactly what colors I went over, this is all of them. Some of them didn't get mentioned in the video because they were used on other figures, like the Vallejo model color khaki wasn't used on the primary figure. The dragon red was used in the kufiya of one of the other figures. And then the fur brown that's showing up, it ended up in the rifle color mix. Honestly, you probably don't need it. You could probably just could use monster brown on the rifle because that's pretty much how the mix ended up. So everyone, thank you very much for watching. If you have any questions about how I painted these Ottomans or um, any other painting techniques or World War I uniform questions, please leave a comment here. Again, everyone have a happy Thanksgiving, and you all have a good night.